name is Emma. I'm with Book Soup, and we're delighted to be hosting Lori Kay, presenting Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper. Lori Kay began her career in radio at KFRC AM in San Francisco. She wrote and co-produced numerous radio rock specials for RKO before moving on to write Dick Clark's weekly radio countdown show. She then moved on to TV and film as a writer, producer, and casting director, where she still works today, handling both creative content and line producing for docuseries pilots. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lori Kay.
Thank you. And hello and welcome, everybody. I'm so thrilled to see you all, and so excited to have you all here to hang out with me at Super Cool Book Soup. Thanks so much, for coming to my very first book launch signing event ever. I'm thrilled to see so many people I've known for ages, as well as meet up with a number of newcomers I'll hopefully get to know. And I can't wait to tell you all about my book, Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, My Life Leading Up to John Lennon's Last Interview. As I'm sure you already know, it's not a Beatles bio, it's my memoir, the story of my early rock radio-related life and career wrapped around what tragically turned out to be John Lennon's last day on the planet, December 8th, 1980. Exactly 43 years ago, which is also when I co-conducted the RKO Radio interview with him and Yoko at the Dakota in New York, mere hours before he was shot and killed. My book, of course, features so many details and quotes and amazing impressions from that awesome interview with John Lennon, as well as from a number of meetups with other musicians I've been lucky enough to talk with over the years. Everyone from former Fab Four members George Harrison and Paul McCartney, plus Beatles producer George Martin, Beatles idol Little Richard, and tons more favorite artists and bands of mine over the years, from the Ramones to Talking Heads. And when it comes to my life story, I use my book to explain how music made it possible for me, starting out as a toddler, to successfully survive my difficult, dysfunctional family upbringing. And thanks so much ever since to the multiple parts that sex and drugs and rock and roll have all played in my life. Something I realized while considering writing my memoir was that unless you've kept a daily diary and written down what goes on in your life every day of the year, which unfortunately I never did, ever, lifetime memories can be really hard to come back to, especially the older you get. Plus, if you're not a celebrity, which I'm not, getting a literary agent and publisher eventually interested in your memoir can also be extremely difficult, unless you're willing to self-publish, which I never was. So lucky for me, I was able to make it work and find a traditional independent publishing company that was super eager to read my self-edited first draft and send me a contract right away to publish my book. Yay! Still, there are a number of reasons it took me nearly 40 years, almost 4 decades, since the afternoon I spent with John and Yoko to even begin writing all about my entire life up to, during, and just beyond that point. Not only was I feeling much too miserable, and yes, extremely guilty, to sit down and put together my story on paper, but I was also concerned about embarrassing my mother, since I knew I'd need to truthfully describe her decayed single mom treatment of me throughout my childhood, including my teen years. I was also far too busy contemplating and slowly but surely coordinating my upcoming career changes, since I felt the need to leave radio and make the move from on-air to print and eventually over to TV and video, writing and production. My freelance and far beyond full-time gigs kept me wrapped up multiple hours of each and every day and night of the week, so sadly I had no time or energy to even think about concentrating on or coming up with my book. This was despite the fact that, as I say in my introductory first chapter, which I eventually started writing in 2020, following both my mother's passing and, thanks to the pandemic, pretty much putting my TV production work to a complete close, whenever anyone found out over the years that our RKO team and I had conducted John Lennon's final interview, jaws dropped, people gasped, and the inevitable question was asked, "Lori, when are you going to write your book?" Finally, I was able to answer, "Now." Well, believe it or not, the coolest comment that ever convinced me to write my memoir actually came from John Lennon himself. After he begged me to let him autograph, along with Yoko Ono, the copy of her great book, Grapefruit, which I brought to the Dakota with me, I said, "Of course," and thanked him profusely. He was thrilled to be able to sign it for me, since he'd written Grapefruit's introduction, and when I told him how grateful I was, he made a point of telling me how much he himself loved it when authors signed their books for him. So I, of course, told him that when I wrote mine, I'd definitely send him an autographed copy. And he smiled at me like crazy and said, "Great!" which made me feel even more than great. So now I'll read you the first couple pages of my introductory first chapter. It's called Imagine, My Lead Up to Lennon. And like every single one of my book's 18 chapters, it's named after a meaningful rock, pop, or show tune. And then, after that, we'll play you a piece of the interview featuring John and Yoko, with John bringing up his original teenage meeting with Paul McCartney, and then his very first get-together ever with conceptual artist Yoko Ono. So I hope that tells you a bit about my book and what got me to write it. Thank you. So chapter 1, Imagine, My Lead Up to Lennon. On December 8th, 1980, I was overflowing with excitement, anticipation, and disbelief as I approached the Dakota Apartments on Manhattan's Upper West Side. I was there to play my part in John Lennon's one and only U.S. radio interview following the release of his and Yoko Ono's brand new album, Double Fantasy. And the voices in my head were telling me that this was without a doubt about to become the best day of my life that I could ever even begin to imagine, and that I was truly the luckiest person on the planet. Visions of thousands of screaming Beatles fans packed into Dodger Stadium so many years earlier swirled through my brain like milkshake in a blender, and I could barely keep myself from swaggering down the sidewalk as my associates and I approached the security booth area right outside the Dakota's entrance. I'd flown out just one day earlier from the West Coast as part of our 3-member RKO Radio team, along with an executive from Warner Brothers Geffen Records. And although our RKO trio had already worked together on a number of attention-getting network radio rock specials and interviews over the past few years, including heading off to London just the year before to hang out with Paul McCartney and Wings, this would be an entirely different ballgame. After all, we were on the verge of meeting up with someone who'd literally disappeared from the music business for the previous 5 years, John Lennon. John had been hunkered down in the role of ultra-happy house husband and attentive father ever since his 18-month-long lost weekend, the time during which he was, by his own admission, miserably separated from Yoko and living in Los Angeles. and he hadn't recorded or released any new music in at least the 5 years since. But now, Double Fantasy, the new album created with his often critically reviled wife Yoko Ono, was his way of opening the door to the 80s and a whole new era. No one else in the world could even begin to imagine how it felt to realize that we were about to become the only American radio gang chosen to help John and Yoko usher that era in. The build-up to our interview had already been somewhat mind-blowing. At one point, while everything was still in the early planning stages, I got a call from someone asking the date, year, and time of my birth, because apparently Yoko was working with her personal astrologer, who was going to take all the information collected and then use it to put together an astrological chart that would then determine the best possible day for our Dakota meetup. Of course, the surprising thing is that even with all that intimate information, and despite the fact that John and Yoko had already planned to head to Hawaii and the West Coast during that time period, somehow Monday, December 8th, 1980, a date that will live forever in freakish rock and roll infamy, was chosen. And now I hope you'd like to hear John Lennon, and Yoko's in on the interview too, exactly 43 years ago. So it's very touching to me.
There's only two artists I've ever worked with for more than one night stand, as it were. That's Paul McCartney and Yoko Ono. I think it's a pretty damn good choice. Because in the history of the Beatles, Paul met me the first day I did Bebopaloola live on stage, okay? And a mutual friend brought him to see my group called the Quarrymen. And we met and we talked after the show, and I saw he had talent, and he was playing guitar backstage and doing 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran. And I turned around to him right then on first meeting and said, "Do you want to join the group?" And he said, And I think he said yes the next day, as I recall it. Now, George came through Paul, and Ringo came through George, although, of course, I had a say in where they came from, but the person I actually picked as my partner, who I recognized had talent, and I could get on with, was Paul. Now, 12, or however many years later, I met Yoko. I had the same feeling. It was a different field, but I had the same feeling. So I think as a talent scout, I've done pretty damn well.
Can you tell us about that meeting?
With Yoko? Yeah. Well, it was sort of 1966, and I got a call from a guy called John Dunbar, who used to be married to Marian Faithfull. And he said, "Oh, I've got this, there's this fantastic Japanese girl coming from New York, and she's going to put on an exhibition at my gallery." I get down there, and it's the night before the opening. I thought there was going to be a big party and an opening and the whole bit, you know. I get there, it's all white and quiet, and there's just these strange things all on display, like an apple on a stand for £200, when the pound was worth $8 or something, or whatever. And all this very peculiar stuff, and a ladder with a painting on the sky, or it looked like a blank canvas on the ceiling with a spyglass hanging from it. So I get up the ladder and I look through this spyglass, and it said yes. And I took that as a personal positive message, because most of the avant-garde artists of that period were all negative. And then the guy introduced me to her, and she didn't know who the hell I was. She had no idea. And I was saying, well, I thought, this is a good con, isn't it? Apples for £200 and hammer and nail. Who's going to buy this? You know? I didn't know what concept art was, which in a nutshell is the idea is more important than the object. So I see the hammer hanging on the thing with a few nails underneath. I said, well, can I at least hammer a nail in? You know, I've come all the way from the suburbs for this. And she says, no.
Because before the opening, and I wanted everything to be right,
you know. She didn't want the thing messed up, you know. So anyway, the gallery owner has a little word with her, and she comes over and she says, all right, there's no smiling or anything, because you know how she is. She's not running for office. She never was, so she looks at me and she says, give me 5 shillings and you can hammer a nail in. So I looked at her and I said, I'll give you an imaginary 5 shillings and hammer an imaginary nail in, okay? And that's when we connected really, and we looked at each other like, that sort of, something went on. People always think in terms of John and Yoko just got together and the Beatles split, and we've been together longer than the Beatles.
How did your music start reflecting your meeting and your spiritual bond with Yoko? Was it immediate?
It was immediate.
Yes, immediate.
I used to have a place where I worked in the house again, upstairs, in my first incarnation with my other wife and kids. And I used to make kind of freaky music at home. And you would hear it coming through on things like Tomorrow Never Knows on Revolver or Rain and some little backwards things, but I never made that the whole track.
But you had sort of freaky stuff, cassettes,
but at home I would make far freakier stuff, which I would take the sort of most usable and add it to the Beatles, or to my tracks of the Beatles, whether it was Walrus or Strawberry, but whatever, fiddle around a bit, or put loops, or, something fun. But at home I was really far out, and I had a kind of little studio, which was really just a lot of tape recorders, and we made 2 versions that way. She came over for a date, as it were, and I didn't know what to do, and she didn't know what to do. I said, I didn't know what to do with her, so I said, you want to go upstairs and play with the tapes? So, because we didn't know what to do, we did play with the tapes all night. And we made 2 versions, and I was showing her all my different tape recordings and how I made the funny sounds.
You were running around.
I was running around pushing buttons and playing the mellotron, and she started into the Yoko Ono stuff, which is now stuff you hear on B-52s with Lenny Lovitch and all that stuff. She started doing this, ow, and all that, and I thought, this is great, and I was going on the tapes, and she was going, ow, and we made a tape all night, and in the morning we made love as the sun came up.
I don't know about you, but just hearing that tonight, my heart, it's taken me back 43 years. It's amazing.
What was it like the first moment you saw John Lennon? Was it like, wow, or were you calm? Describe it for me.
Well, when we first went in, John and Yoko were upstairs with the photographer from Rolling Stone, Annie Leibovitz, taking pictures. And so Yoko came down first because she wanted to take, Annie wanted to take pictures just with John by himself. Mm-hmm. So first I talked with Yoko for about a half an hour, primarily, even though of course Dave Sholin was the other interviewer from RKO. Yoko and I pretty much related because we were both the only gals there. Yeah. So we were talking, and then we were all talking, and all of a sudden the door to their private office that we were sitting in opened a crack, and I saw John Lennon's glasses right through the crack in the door, his round glasses, and his nose. And I almost, I can't even describe how I felt. I almost went, and he walked in and he was apologizing for being late, and me being the smart ass still, and back then that I was, I looked at him and said under my breath, "Can't you tell we're in the middle of an interview?" And he started laughing, and he came down and he sat down right next to me on the love seat. And I couldn't believe it. I was going to be sitting there for the afternoon next to John Lennon on the love seat. It was amazing. And throughout the whole interview, the way he would look at me, and when he was so validating of the way, he loved the way I asked my questions, and he would say to me, "Exactly, yes, love, that's it." And he would push down his glasses on his nose and look at me over his glasses like I was important to him, and I felt like I'd made a friend for life. Did that answer your question okay?
Yes, that was awesome. Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? Yes, sir.
The hard thing on that is hearing the laugh from Yoko, right? Like knowing how her life's going to change a couple of years or a couple hours later. Have you had any contact with her in the 43 years since?
That night, after I found out that John had been shot, before it was announced that he had been killed, I had heard that he had been brought to the Roosevelt Hospital in New York. And I took a cab immediately there and saw Yoko through the glass door of the hospital, and she was holding on to someone and crying hysterically. And as much as I wanted to go in and say, "Oh, Yoko, everything's going to be okay," I realized looking at her that it wasn't, and that John hadn't just been shot, that he had obviously been killed. And so instead of going in and bugging her because I didn't want to remind her of that afternoon leading up to his death, I called RKO Radio Network based in New York, because my former news director was the executive there then, and then went and spent the night there doing interviews and answering questions, and then the next morning was on the Today Show, and then left and went back to the West Coast and wrote the radio special John Lennon, the Man, the Memory, that aired 6 days after his passing. Yes.
How did you get back in the groove of reporting after all of that happened? Yeah.
I'm not sure that I ever did, to be very honest, not for years. And that's definitely discussed in my book, how hard it was for me, the fact that I basically got out of radio and started doing other things and print. And before I went to New York to co-conduct the John Lennon interview, I had already scheduled a number of interviews coming up also with RKO. And so right after John Lennon, when I got back, within the first week, Barry Manilow, Neil Diamond, I mean, it was just so weird. And I was sitting there thinking, I don't know if I can ever be with musicians again as long as I live. And I was, but it took me quite a while. But that's in the book. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
When you talked to the other Beatles, did they talk about John?
Well, I talked to the other Beatles before I interviewed John. The first one was George Harrison, and then and that was in late in '78, and then Paul McCartney in London in June of '79. And so we all had a lot of very similar topics that I would bring up. For example, Elvis Presley, who had died in August of '77. And I knew that they had all been Elvis Presley fans, so of course I wanted to talk about that with them. And I did with all of them. And in the book, there's plenty of quotes about all of them and their love of Elvis. So that was really wonderful for me.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
The book is mostly John Lennon, but are there any other really memorable interviews you've done that stick in your mind? Nothing's going to match this, but...
Paul McCartney, George Harrison. George Martin was an incredible interview right after his bio came out, All You Need Is Ears. I was so thrilled to be able to interview him, and it was just a great afternoon, and he autographed my copy lovingly for me of the book. It was just incredible. And other wonderful interviews I've done, Little Richard, who'd always been one of my favorites since I was a little kid. Since before I ever heard the Beatles, I listened to Little Richard. So that was amazing. And there's a number of others listed. The Ramones have always been my favorite punk band. So being one of the very first West Coast interviews that they ever did was awesome. And that was at KFRC when I was doing a new music special at the time, and interviewed them, and then a short time later, Talking Heads. So both of those were very cool. And there were tons more. And then years later, and these aren't in the book, I produced music video magazines for BMG, Metalhead, which was heavy metal, and Country Music Video Magazine, and Slammin', which was rap and R&B, and was able to produce and also do a bunch of interviews for all of those as well. So, and some people that I worked with on those are here tonight, so that's really cool. So, yeah, I've been very lucky my entire life as far as meeting up with and talking to musicians. Yes?
Were you surprised at how positive and upbeat John Lennon was when you interviewed him?
Well, you know, that's interesting that you would ask that, because I was really nervous about interviewing John Lennon before I started, because I thought of him as so intellectual and so very, very concerned about being asked questions about the Beatles or his past, because we were told by the record company, no, you don't bring up the Beatles, you don't bring up the past. This is all about his present and double fantasy. So I hadn't planned to ask any questions. So John himself bringing up, as you heard, how he met Paul McCartney, and George, and Ringo, that was so awesome. And that wasn't the only discussion that he had about being in the Beatles. It was really crazy and great. So it was amazing, almost right from the start, how incredible he made me feel. And like I said, how validated he made me feel. I'd never been so complimented like that in an interview in my life. And even though I'd had great interviews, for example, the Paul McCartney interview was wonderful, and I felt I'd made friends, and, you know, I had a loving afternoon with them in London, Paul and Linda and Wings. Still, with John Lennon, it was like meeting up with somebody who was automatically a friend and had so much in common with me, I couldn't believe it. And I do talk about all of that in the book, everything that I felt that we had in common. Yes?
I'm wondering, like, that day before you went to interview him, did you have any feelings or intuitions that something was going to happen that day, or did it just feel extra important?
You mean a feeling that something horrible was going to happen? No.
Did you have any, sorry, I know it's kind of a out there question, but did you have any feeling like that day was going to be extra significant?
It was going to be what?
Extra significant in, you know?
No, all I thought was that I was going to be meeting my idol. And I had felt the same way talking with George Harrison and meeting up with Paul McCartney, that those were going to be great. And I just had the feeling that the John Lennon interview was going to be even more special because it had been so long since he'd been in the music business, basically. So I was really excited about hooking up with him and Yoko. Fan of them both. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
The original interview, and then you mentioned the special that you did 6 days later. Are they available anywhere to be heard?
Well, there is no more RKO Radio network. And the special itself and the interview were all were all owned by the company that bought the RKO Radio network and all of their stuff. So technically, I can't tell you who owns it now. And the fact is that the interview itself, the full interview, was never released by RKO. The special was not just played on RKO stations 6 days after John Lennon passed, but it was syndicated. It was all over the country, actually all over the world, from what I've heard. So, and that was a 3-hour special. And the interview itself was just about 3 hours as well, although we spent a longer time with them. Well, I hope you all read and really like my book, and please be sure to leave a glowing 5-star review, because I can definitely use the promo. And thank you so much.
Congratulations. So
Thank
great.
you.
It's great to hear you speak and hear that interview. Yeah, amazing.
Awesome. To see
To John J.O.N.
Hi, Lori. Hi. It's me, Kellen from Laser.
Okay.
I'm excited to read your book.
Well, I'm excited to hear what you both think.
I know you'll hear. Hey, thank you so much.
Do you want me to use your name?
Sure. I didn't know much in all our trips to the museum. Thank you for everything. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.